The reasons for extremism. The so-called social scientists and psychologists of the world, who continuously try to diagnose the root causes of extremism and the obvious growth of extremism in America, repeatedly fail to properly diagnose the issue. The first thing they fail to deduce is the obvious link between the growth of extremism and the prevalence of the root cause of extremism, which are directly linked. In other words, there is most definitely an outside factor, environment, and/or external influence, which exists outside the psyche of a radicalized individual, which prompted their journey or fascination in radicalized groups. It is this factor which has caused the rise in the number of extremist groups in America in the past 2 decades, and it is this factor which in all likelihood will continue to see more individuals becoming radicalized in America as long as this motivational factor is continued to also grow in prevalence. That single contributing factor causing more extremism in this country is the growing perception of an unjust government. This single factor is the overwhelming cause of more radicalization than any other perceived reasons which the so-called government experts try to attribute to the reasons causing radicalization. The reason why most of the so-called experts who look into the issue or claim some form of expertise in the area of radicalization of American citizens completely miss this mark is due both in part to A, the simple fact that themselves government employees, or the research is government funded. This in turn makes the opinions of those conducting the so-called research and the authors of any so-called research papers extraordinarily biased. To put it most simply, when the king asks his advisors, "Why doth my people seem so discontented with my actions?" the advisors wishing to keep their heads or their jobs will always answer the king, "The problem is with your subjects, sire, and never the actions which you take." The second part, B, is somewhat similar in that the same researchers and authors, being themselves government agents, have a vested interest in their own perceived authority and right to govern, which causes in such researchers an inability to objectively understand why the very actions they themselves take on a regular basis or the actions they believe they ought to possess the authority to undertake causes an inability of the researchers to objectively look at the situation. This is where the king asks his advisors, "Why doth my subjects dislike my policies of allowing my advisors to spy on the people anger my subjects so?" To which the advisor, believing he should be vested with such authority to spy on his fellow citizens, honestly but incorrectly tells the king, "I cannot understand why they doth protest such reasonable and fair policies, my liege." Those two factors alone have caused 99.9% of the research done in this area to be both worthless and incorrect, as the authors of such research papers fail to understand completely how or why radicalized individuals start to feel disenfranchised and even possibly under threat from their own government. As evidence of this fact, one need only look at the growth of radicalization in the population on a timeline, as it correlates to perceived notions of political instability, increased government surveillance, the dulling of true justice in the courts, whereby money now decides the level of justice a single person is afforded. This is especially true as during this same time span, we have witnessed the coming of power of the corporate person, aka corporations, as a legal entity able to duck and dodge the responsibilities an individual would normally have to face for crimes committed due to the legal personhood status of corporations, whereby police departments have been granted the ability to seize citizens' property based upon criminal allegations which are somehow free from due process procedures, when eminent domain can be utilized by deep-pocketed corporate citizens arguing their wiliness and ability to pay the higher property taxes, when police are killing as many citizens with their guns as cigarettes do with cancer on a yearly average, when politicians seem to be little more than ineffectual puppets of corporate citizens up for auction to the highest bidders, when the spending power and living wage of the average citizen experience degradation instead of improvement year after year, when the standard social citizenry experience is that of either attacking or being attacked by your fellow citizens for any number of perceived insults or due to unintentional failures to properly identify another or be properly identified oneself. It is these factors which cause the perceived need for tribalism and power through numbers. The perceived need and psychological feeling of a lack of true community will many times cause individuals to seek out who they believe to be much like themselves in order to stand together as a group. The issue with this is the lack of perceived availability of sameness found in today's society amongst the American citizenry, which causes the beginnings of xenophobic thoughts in the mind of the individuals. These are citizens who quite rightly feel attacked by today's society, cheated by large corporations, let down by an unresponsive government more interested in collecting its taxes and enforcing its own laws than bringing any tangible benefit to the citizenry. Many just feel wronged altogether by their government. Radicalized American adults display and seek the same thing which those who join street gangs do, only at a much more cerebral level which they themselves are not even aware of most often. Protection from the outside perceived dangerous or attacking society, strength in numbers against the awesome powers possessed by government and billion-dollar corporations, sameness of thought and beliefs, a chance to have to re-find or recapture the purpose society has robbed them of, and which the government seemingly won't allow them to possess. Many, in fact, actually fear physical attack from others perceived as threats or the government itself. A fact made all the worse by actual governmental attempts to disarm and criminalize many such groups, which in turn becomes the actual cause for armament for many of these groups. A true factor which government agents are never able to understand, either through willful blindness or their own vested egos, which tell themselves, "We alone have a right to arms," but they do not purely because we are government. The reason why analyses done by government are incorrect is because every single one of them fails to recognize that it is literally bad government which is the cause of extremism. This is exactly why we have seen the explosive growth of extremism and extremist groups over the past decade. Only the blindest of researchers could not see the obvious correlation between the growth of government authority, expansion of government power, and the increase in perceived corruption of that same government over the past same decade and the growth of the number of extremists. The fact that these two phenomena or occurrences have happened simultaneously is absolutely no coincidence. And despite what government researchers and analyses claim, the rise and increase of the one is the direct cause of the other. This is why the research and current prevailing theories as to why there has been such a large increase in extremist groups is really a problem. It is because government researchers paid to research the issue constantly recommend more government or greater government authority as the only cure to extremism, when it is exactly the perceived disregarding of constitutional rights and trampling of long-held American ideas of governmental limits by an overmighty government which is the root cause of extremism. This same phenomenon, which is the root cause of extremism, is the same root cause which often created insurgents in Iraq. As American soldiers went into people's homes and killed people in different villages, those actions in of themselves caused there to be more insurgents as increased numbers of Iraqis began to feel wronged by U.S. soldiers. In other words, it was the presence of American soldiers as occupiers which often caused or created more insurgents. So too is it the rise of an overmighty American government detached from the constitutional boundaries which it once respected and obeyed at all levels, which in turn has seen the rise and increase in number of extremist groups. However, government researchers routinely fail to recognize this obvious correlation between the actions of the government and the increase in the number of extremists, and mostly due to the fact it is government agents or government-funded researchers which allegedly investigate the problem. So either out of fear of biting the hand that feeds them, or the researchers' own psychological buy-in as a government agent themselves, causes the majority of such reports and research to completely miss the true and most prevalent cause of the increase in extremism and extremist groups. While not all extremism is born of perceived bad government, a large portion of it is. At the same time, there are other factors which also attribute and strengthen people's decision towards extremism due to the perceived rise of bad government devoid of constitutional boundaries. This has to do with the psychological fears or needs, which I discussed it earlier. If you start with the causes of extremism as beginning from an absolute state of disenfranchisement from the powers perceived to control much of the world around you, aka the government, then one can easily become susceptible to those groups which offer not only a perceived reason for that disenfranchisement. Example, it's the blacks, the Jews, white people, the rich, immigrants, Christian fundamentalists, the media, guys named Joel, or whomever can logically, or oftentimes even illogically, weave together a narrative to explain the sense of disenfranchisement from the society and government which such people are feeling. Once the perceived responsible party has been identified and accepted by the disenfranchised person, the group will normally then reinforce that belief. This is done through the use of stories of identifiability. In other words, while the disenfranchised individual may accept the given scapegoat group for the disenfranchisement, the person still has not yet completely psychologically bought into the narrative or explanation leading to the targeting of the scapegoat people. Remember, thus far, the disenfranchised person is only in a state of vulnerability to the supplanting of a scapegoat. This should not be surprising. Just as if one were in physical pain of physical discomfort, they would seek out a diagnosis of the cause of that pain, as well as a cure. The pre-extremist can be thought of as experiencing a sort of psychological pain and/or form of mental discomfort or discontentment, for which they too will seek out a cause and a cure. The danger becomes then, who is it that will supply that mental diagnosis for the disenfranchised individual? For some, it can be a politician and their campaign slogans. No one can deny the absolute extremism which we have witnessed of late on both sides of the aisle. Individuals literally justifying violence against otherwise complete strangers merely based upon the other's political beliefs. Antifa, Black Lives Matter, MA, whatever the movement may be, it cannot be denied that at least some individuals from each of those groups have acted out violently towards their fellow American citizens. The one thing that all those who did or have acted in a violent manner against their perceived scapegoat are all in fact suffering from the same phenomenon which I am describing. The only difference between the extremists found in and among each of those groups is the description of their disenfranchisement and the difference in chosen scapegoat target. However, the psychological causes are the exact same. It's funny to wonder if the extremists from opposite groups might actually get along with each other if they only took the time to realize and understand just how alike they truly are. In fact, it is the extremists which have more in common than those who have the same political beliefs as far as how they experience and react to the world in which they live. However, we have witnessed this three-step phenomenon throughout history and wherever extremist actions have been undertaken. First comes the disenfranchisement from government, either in the belief one's government is either doing too much or too little to alleviate the causes of discontentment. Second, the introduction of a believable narrative leading to the scapegoat target. Hitler did this to great effect during the 1930s and 1940s. Third is the group's shared perceived sameness of experience combined with the denigrating of the scapegoat party. From there, the acts undertaken by extremists are easy to understand, as in the mind of the extremists, their actions are not extreme at all. Rather, the extremist actions taken by those caught in such a cycle will inevitably be viewed by the extremist as justifiable or even an act of self-defense and self-preservation. It is through this mentality whereby the acts of extreme violence by otherwise rational and sane people begin to make sense on a psychological level, in that to the extremists their actions have become, if not justified, then completely necessary for their notions of self-preservation. Once this level of extremism has been achieved, then it makes sense the extraordinarily radical actions which can be taken by such people who truly believe no less than their survival or the survival of their way of life is under threat. So how does one combat extremism? First and foremost, one could argue a government which is responsive to the will of the people, in which the people believe they are not only heard but listened to. A government which does not continuously encroach upon the liberties and rights of its citizens. A government which holds itself accountable to the letter of the law and punishes those government agents with loss of employment or jail time for violations of the civil rights of its citizens. A judiciary which holds the rights and privacies of the citizenry to be fundamental and of greater importance than any notions of criminal prosecutions, and therefore routinely disregards evidence of questionable origins and/or arrests made by disregarding of the civil rights of individuals. No longer can there be a judiciary which routinely adopts the notion the ends justify the means in criminal investigation and criminal prosecutions by granting extraordinary exceptions to violations of civil rights merely because such violations uncover incriminating evidence. Inevitably, the greatest and probably the most effective way of combating extremism is to do away with those conditions which foster and create disenfranchisement by the citizenry. A government whereby several letters from the voters found in a politician's constituency about an issue of importance carries the same weight as the issues presented by the million-dollar lobbyists. A government whereby police respect the rights of citizens. These are, in fact, the best ways to combat extremism. However, such recommendations are never made or considered. Most importantly, courts need to disallow cops being able to utilize hindering investigations or resisting arrests when the arrest is unlawful. I know in many states like California, they can't charge someone with resisting arrest unless the arrest is lawful. However, in many states, the act of rightfully defending yourself from being unlawfully arrested in of itself can carry with it charges, which in turn allows dirty cops to have prosecuted innocent individuals. This simple act allows cops to literally charge innocent individuals for rightfully protesting their unlawful incarceration. Police then use resisting arrest to unlawfully arrest innocent individuals. While this paper is in no way meant to be a complete denigration of the manner in which cops operate these days, the fact that bad government or disenfranchisement with the government is over 90% of the root causes of extremism, one can't help but think that the respecting of people's civil rights, equity in the courts, and a feeling that their issues are listened to and taken into consideration by their elected officials would curb the rise in extremism. However, this direct cause or correlation between extremism and the increase in police powers and authorities to surveillance, along with the rise of the corporate persons and the slow degradation of the rights of citizens over the same time span. For until the environment from which extremism is spawned is removed, we will continue to see extremism and its increase in prevalence continue to grow alongside and in response to the increase in bad government.